Hello, Year 10. We're going to start off today with the answers from yesterday's lesson. The best way for me to do this is to just give you the coordinate which you should have found as the point of intersection. And for these particular ones, if you drew your coordinate axes out nice and neatly and you plotted accurately, then you should have found that they were fairly nice points to read off. So for the first one, you should have got 2, 4. The second one, 5, 1.5. The third one was 3, 1. And then finally, the last one was 1, 5. Okay, so today we're going to move on with our plotting to looking at plotting a quadratic curve. And that is where we've got a function involving an x squared. So for example, we might have y equals x squared plus 5. And so knowing our square numbers is going to be really useful for this. So first of all, recall exercise. Could you pause the video and write down the first 15 square numbers from memory? Okay, so you should have found that these were your answers. So if you check those, now most of these are really about you knowing your times tables. So this one is 12 times 12. It's only these two here which are a little bit trickier to remember. So make sure you know those. You need to know those by heart, and if you don't, you need to learn them. But they are going to prove to be particularly useful for today's work. So another thing that's going to be useful for today is being able to square a negative number. So what happens when we square a negative number? We're going to talk this through first of all. So for example, if I find negative 2 squared, then that means negative 2 multiplied by negative 2, which gives me an answer of positive 4. And something similar will happen with any negative number that we square. Whenever we square a negative number, we get a positive answer. Now, if you square a negative on a calculator, you've got to be really, really careful. And we're going to talk that through as well, because this is going to be really useful for plotting later on for our calculations. When you're squaring a negative number on a calculator, you need to use a bracket or a pair of brackets to put round your negative, and then use the square button. So if you've got your calculator to hand, I'd like you to try this. Could you try first of all entering on your calculator negative 4 squared without the bracket and press equals, see what it gives you, and then enter a bracket, negative 4, close the bracket and square it and see what that gives you. So pause the video and have a go at doing that. Okay, so we already know that the answer to this should be positive 16. 16 is the correct answer, but you will have found that without the brackets, your calculator would give you negative 16. And that's because it's using BIDMAS, and BIDMAS tells us to do indices before subtraction. So it's doing 4 squared and then making it negative. So to get the answer we're looking for, we need to put brackets around the negative so that we're telling the calculator we're squaring everything, including the negative. Okay, so now we're going to move on to plotting the quadratic curves, and we're going to start with the most basic kind of quadratic, which is where y equals x squared. So these are our x values. These are going to be the x part of our coordinates, and we're going to need to square each of these to find what y is equal to. Now, my top tip for this is to start with the positive x values first of all, because those are easier. You won't make mistakes with the negative numbers because they're all positive. So even though the negatives come first in the grid, start with the positive side of the grid. So first of all, y equals 0 squared. That's 0 multiplied by 0, which is 0. So I know when x is 0, y is 0. Now, when x is 1, y equals 1 squared, which is 1 multiplied by 1, which is 1. And then when x equals 2 squared, when x equals 2, y equals 2 squared, which is 2 multiplied by 2, which is 4. So there is the positive part of my grid. I'm now going to think about the negative numbers. When x is negative 1, y is negative 1 squared, which is negative 1 times negative 1, which works out to be positive 1. And then the same for negative 2 squared, that works out to be positive 4. And what you can see here is some symmetry in the grid here. There's almost like a line of symmetry at 0, and then we get the same values reflected out from that point. And now I'm going to plot those points. So I'm going to start with negative 2, 4, negative 1, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, and 2, 4. And so what you can see as well is some symmetry in the way those points are plotted. Now, there is no good way for me to freehand join these points up on the computer. It will just look a mess. But you should always be trying your best with a pencil to join these points up to get a nice smooth curve. And it's worth starting quite lightly in pencil first of all, and then when you're happy with the shape, go over it a little bit harder. So what I've done is I've gone to a graph package to graph this for you, and this is what it should look like. So we get a nice smooth curve, and this curve is called a parabola, this type of shape, and all quadratic curves will have this sort of shape. You also need to know that this bit at the bottom here is called the turning point or the vertex of the graph. Okay, so we're going to move on to a slightly more complicated version of a quadratic now. Y equals x squared, subtract 3. So what we need to do is square the x value and then subtract 3. And again, I'm going to start with the positive x values because those are easier. So when x is 0, I'm going to square 0 and then subtract 3. So 0 times 0, subtract 3. I've got to do bid maths, so I'm multiplying first. That's of course just 0. Then I can subtract the 3 and that gives me negative 3. Next, when x is 1, I'm going to have 1 squared, subtract 3. 1 times 1, subtract 3, which is 1, subtract 3, and so negative 2. And then when x is 2, 2 squared, which I'm going to jump right over here, is 4, subtract 3, and that gives me 1. And now I'm going to deal with my negatives, bearing in mind that I know I'm expecting some sort of symmetry to my curve here, and that's a useful check. So if I square negative 1, I know I'm going to get positive 1, and then I need to subtract 3, which gives me negative 2. And then when x is negative 2, I'm going to square negative 2, which gives me positive 4, and then I'm going to subtract 3, which gives me 1. Now, don't expect quadratics to always be reflecting around the x equals 0 here. That won't always be the case, but with the first few we do, that is going to happen. So now I'm going to plot these points, negative 2, 1, negative 1, negative 2, 0, negative 3, 1, negative 2, and 2, 1. And we get the same shape as we did in the previous example, but everything has been shifted down by 3. And that is because we were subtracting 3 from x squared, whereas the first graph was just x squared. Again, I'm not going to be able to join these up nice and neatly. You should be doing that. But I've done a screenshot from my graphing package, and this is the sort of shape that we should get. Bit more information now. We talked about this point being the turning point or the vertex. You also need to know that these points here, where the curve crosses the x-axis, those are called the roots. Right, slightly more complicated again. We are going to graph y equals 2x squared, add 1. So thinking about BIDMAS tells us to do the indices first. So we're doing x squared first, then to multiply. So then we're going to multiply by 2. And then to add, so then we're going to add 1. And again, I'm going to start with the positive part of my graph here. So 0 squared multiplied by 2, add 1. So 0 squared is 0, multiplied by 2 is just 0, and then add 1, that gives me 1. Next, when x equals 1, 2 multiplied by 1 squared, add 1. I'm going to square 1, and that's just going to give me 1. Then I'm going to multiply it by 2, which will give me 2. And then finally, I'm going to add 1, which gives me 3. Then when x equals 2, 2 multiplied by 2 squared, add 1. So square first of all, that's going to give me 4. Multiplied by 2 will give me 8, and then add 1, and I get an answer of 9. Then I'm going to do my negatives. So I'm going to remember that when I square negative 1, I'm going to get 1. So I'll end up with 2 times 1 plus 1 again, which is 3. So I'm getting this reflection again. And then when x is negative 2, I'm going to square that, and that will give me positive 4. Multiplied by 2 gives me 8, and add 1 gives me 9. And now I can plot my points. Negative 2, 9. Negative 1, 3. 0, 1. 1, 3. And 2, 9. So again, a similar shape. It's actually been stretched more parallel to the y-axis, and that's because we've multiplied all the x squareds by 2, and also it's been shifted up, and that's because we added 1. So again, I'm going to struggle to join these up nice and smoothly, but that's what you should be doing every time. And again, here's my screenshot. It's not quite got the same axes here, so it looks slightly more stretched out. This one right here is the turning point. No roots because it's not crossing the x-axis at all. Okay, we're now going to look at a bit more of a challenge question. So our quadratic this time, our function is much more complicated. We've got y equals x squared, add 2x, subtract 2. So I'm going to square 0, multiply 0 by 2, and subtract 2. So 0 squared is 0. 2 times 0 is 0, and then subtract 2. When I sum those up, I get negative 2. Then 1 squared, add 2 times 1, subtract 2. That's going to give me 1 squared is 1, 2 times 1 is 2, and then subtract 2. This will give me 3, take away 2, which is 1. 2 squared, add 2 times 2, subtract 2. So 2 squared is 4, 2 times 2 is 4, and then subtract 2. So I get 8, subtract 2, which is 6. And then I'm on to my negatives. So negative 1 squared, add 2 times negative 1, add 1. Negative 1 squared is 1. 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. Oh, I seem to have got a plus 1 there. That's because I copied and pasted it from the last example. It should be a subtract 2. And when I sum those, that gives me negative 3. And then finally, negative 2 squared, add 2 lots of negative 2, subtract 2. That's going to give me negative 2 squared is 4. 2 times negative 2 is negative 4, and then subtract 2. So 4 subtract 4 is 0, and then subtract 2 gives me negative 2. So what you can see here is I don't have this reflection about the 0 anymore. It's shifted across. There is still some reflection there. So at some point in your quadratic table, the values will start to repeat, but not always either side of 0. And here we've just got these negative 2's repeating either side of negative 3. So now I'm going to plot those points. And what you'll find is that you've got a slightly, a graph that's slightly sort of moved off to the left-hand side. So the line of symmetry is actually here rather than at the y-axis. And again, I should be joining these up, but I'm going to struggle to do that neatly on the computer. So I've done my screenshot again. And here we've got a turning point or a vertex, a pair of roots, and then this point right here where it crosses the y-axis is the y-intercept. So vertex or turning point, roots, and y-intercept. Now you're going to need to pause the video and have a go at plotting these coordinates here, giving you some instructions for how to draw your x-axis and your y-axis. And if you've got coloured pencils or even coloured pens if you're careful, you actually only need to draw this out once and then you can do these again on the same axes. But you will need to draw separate grids for every one to work out what your coordinates are going to be. Question 5 is a particular challenge. So I'll give you the answers to these next lesson, which will be next week now. Have a go, pause the video and see if you can answer these questions.